Everybody. Welcome everybody to the LPLS talk for tonight. And just to tell you, my name's Eric Blair. I'm president of LPLS, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Francis Wood tonight,
Barbara.
who's an expert on China and the Chinese Communist Party. Francis, it's a great pleasure to have you. I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to do a proper introduction, and we'll start off the session. Thank you. Could everybody switch off their microphones now, please? I'm switching mine off.
Right, thank you, Eric. So, yes, welcome, Francis, whom I've known for many years. Francis studied art, history and languages, including, very unusually for the times, Chinese. And she first visited the country back in 1971, when the Chinese Communist Party was half the age that it is now, and when the towering skylines of the cities of China that we see now were, some parts of them were cabbage fields still. So it was a very different place. And she's been on many visits since then, and being able to speak the language gives her a perspective that isn't available to most of us. She spent her professional life at the British Library, and indeed some of her childhood too, because her father was involved in the institution. And she and her brother used to play in the old reading room in the middle of the British Museum on Sundays occasionally. So no doubt you'll be interested to know about the British Library coming to Holbeck in Leeds, to Temple. It's rather an amazing departure. So now we're looking forward to you giving us your viewpoint on this extraordinary journey that China has made over this last century, and your part in it. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to now leave the scene myself, and I'm going to stop my video too. So okay.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It's a great honour for me to address people in Leeds. Leeds has a very, very fine Chinese department in which many friends of mine have worked for many, many years, and also my son spent happy years at the university there. I used to go up and see him sometimes, and of course it's a city that's been immortalised by Atkinson Grimshaw, for whom I have a passion which developed when I was studying art at Liverpool. But to come to the point, the meat of today, to talk about the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party, which is an enormous subject. I mean, we could be here for weeks, particularly because I think there are many ways of looking at it, whether you're in China or whether you're in the UK. One of the first things I'd say is that I think that in the current look at which the Chinese themselves are doing, they're writing a new history of the Communist Party. There'll be considerably less of Chairman Mao. He will feature considerably less than he did perhaps in the past. I mean, when I first went in 1971, he was still very much a major figure. When I was a student there in 75 to 76, still a very, very important icon as well as leader. I just show you some of my favorite icons of Chairman Mao tend to be the great concrete statues of him in an overcoat, I mean, all based on the famous photograph of him standing on a beach with the overcoat flapping in the wind. And I'm very fond of the way it's been immortalized in concrete, but these figures are now less and less visible. No idea how to do the next slide now. I went to China first in 1971, and I went in 1975 to 6 as a British Council student. We were 10 students sent in exchange for 10 Chinese students who came over to learn English. And in the picture that you can see here, this is the class. You have various people. That's me. That's Andrew Seaton, who later became Her Majesty's representative in Hong Kong after the handover. Derek Gilman, who ran the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. Richard King, who became professor of Chinese at a university in Canada. Harriet Evans, who became professor of Chinese Studies at University of Westminster, Rose Carr, who became head of the Far East section of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Beth McKillop, who was a mutual friend to Rachel and I. It's how I know Rachel, who worked with me for many years in the British Library and then left to join the V&A, eventually becoming deputy director. And below, you've got me and my long-suffering Chinese roommate, Yang Huimei, in the grounds of Peking University. You can see Chairman Mao behind us in his overcoat outside what was then the library. But since then, I think Peking University has built at least 2 new libraries, ever expanding and ever changing. Yang Huimei was a very patient girl studying international relations. We shared a room for over 6 months and had a good relationship, I think, but it was one of considerable bafflement in a sense on both parts. I mean, I was fascinated by Chinese ideas of housekeeping, how to live in a room. Yang Huimei was easy to live with, but some other people's roommates were difficult. I mean, having been informed that Westerners didn't like spitting very much in the room, they used to kind of lean out of the door and spit into the corridor instead as a sort of in acknowledgement of Western sensibilities. Yang Huimei was much easier and a much finer person to live with. And when we were students in China, one of the things that we had to do was to learn from the peasants and learn from workers. It was very much a time during the Cultural Revolution when China was dominated by the idea of the worker, peasant, soldier. We weren't allowed to go and learn from the army, but we did have to go off and work in the fields that surrounded Peking. I mean, this is us with some Canadians and other students and some of our teachers preparing to go off and work in the fields in the Sijiqing, eternally green, People's Commune, which was just outside Peking, within sight of the new summer palace over the fields. And there, when we were there, we bundled cabbages, we picked spring onions and prepared them for market, and we made winter greenhouses ready for planting cucumbers, which would overwinter in their warm greenhouses. Some of the people here, this includes Anne Paludan, who was the English wife of the Danish ambassador, who came to learn Chinese along with us. Ted Lipman and Anne Wetham were Canadian students, fellow students, but otherwise the rest of us are mostly, there's Beth again. And these were our 2 main teachers when I was in the Languages Institute. Tian Laoshi, the younger one, you can see he's leaning forward, determined man. He was very enthusiastic and quite sharp with us. And behind him, the absolutely lovely figure of Hu Laoshi, teacher Hu, who was terribly gentle. And as a peasant, he was absolutely hopeless. I mean, one of my fond memories is of when we were working along long lines of Chinese cabbage. We had to tie rice straw around them to make them create a better heart. And it was jolly difficult because the rice straw was very short and very easy to break. And you had to hug the cabbage very tightly. And I remember looking back up from my sort of 5th or 6th cabbage and looking, and there was Hu Laoshi, a teacher who, still on his first cabbage, he'd stand up, look at it, adjust the string, which would then break, and he'd have to start all over again. And in a sense, he was he was an object lesson in the hopelessness of the intellectual, which was very much a kind of line at the time. Intellectuals were ivory towerists. They were no good at anything. They were impractical and really hardly worth thinking about. Now, to come to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, possibly July 21st to 23rd. It's interesting that for most people in China today, I think this picture symbolizes the foundation of the Communist Party, the red boat on a lake. This was because the Communist Party started its meeting in an empty girls' school in Shanghai, but the Shanghai authorities got wind of it and they had to leave. And they went off and hid on a boat on a nearby lake. And this boat is therefore the symbol of the continuing meeting. And in a sense, I mean, it's quite a useful symbol because it does avoid the problem of personalities, which is something that dogs the history of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, if we take the founders, the two most important, probably, apart from Mao Zedong, were Li Dazhao and Chen Doxiu, both from Peking University. Mao Zedong was working in Peking University at the time as a very junior library assistant. Li Dazhao was the librarian and also professor of political science. Chen Doxiu was also a lecturer, a professor in Peking University. Li Dazhao was killed in 1927 by the local warlord in Peking, and Chen, who we'll come back to, broke with Chairman Mao later. Of the other founding members, at least 5 were executed by the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's party. 2 defected to the Wang Jingwei puppet regime, which sided with the Japanese. 1 died young in Moscow. 1 became a Trotskyist, but he was welcomed back later. 1 survived until beaten to death in the Cultural Revolution. Zhang Guotao and Chen Doxiu, who we mentioned above, have serious differences with Mao, so split away. And only Dong Biwu and Mao survive. In Dong Biwu's case, he became president and acting chairman of the Communist Party. And his survival through all that time is still something of a mystery to many. When I was at Peking University, I joined with three other British students. We joined a class which was intended for Chinese workers and soldiers. And we had 3 people from the People's Liberation Army in our class, and otherwise the rest of the class there weren't any peasants, but there were workers from local factories who had been sent to Peking University for a year's course in Chinese history, which would enable them to go back to their work units and do their propaganda work better with a firmer foundation in the recent history of China. And we had, apart from our lessons in history, in which we took China from, in my case, just from the Ming to pretty well the present day, on every Saturday morning, we had lessons in Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought for 2 hours from 8 o'clock in the morning, which was quite a struggle to get to for British students who were unused to such a serious approach to study, that you actually did it on Saturday, very early in the morning. And one of the things that we were taught in this political class was Mao's 10 great line struggles. This was from between 1921 and 1949. I mean, in effect, they were always presented as line struggles, but this was in effect the story of how Mao Zedong successfully found himself at the top and stayed at the top of the Communist Party for so many years. And you can see that some of the, I haven't got all of the 10 here, but Chen Doxiu, one of the founders with him, was a right deviationist. He was described as a bourgeois democratic opportunist and capitulationist. And he died in 1942 of natural causes. But Zhang Guotao, who you can see here, was described as a right flightist, and he managed to die in 1979 in Canada. He escaped to Canada, wrote his memoirs, and there. You have Chiu Bai, who was too close to Moscow, but he ended up being executed by the Kuomintang in 1935. Li San was too close to Moscow as well. And then there were 28.5 Bolsheviks who were also condemned for their closeness to Moscow. So really the story of the Communist Party, certainly up to 1949, was one of struggles between people with different ideas of how China should advance. I was always amused by the importance of 10, that you had the 10 great line struggles, which reflected the Qianlong Emperor's 10 great campaigns in the 18th century. China is very characterized by numbers. There's a great fondness for numbers, and things are often enumerated endlessly. We were taught history, sort of separate from Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought history. We were taught history, and we came up to particularly the victory in 1949 of the Communist Party. Now, there was an interesting thing. This is part of the problem of looking at recent history in China, is changes of approach. When we arrived in 1975 in China, there were a series of political campaigns which culminated in January 1976 in a campaign which was described as being carried out against people in high places of high authority taking the capitalist road. And in the spring of 1976, this was then sort of fined down to one person. And the person who was taking the capitalist road was Deng Xiaoping. And his name was all over the big character posters in the department and in the outside in Peking University. He was condemned as a person taking a capitalist line. Now, there was a slight complication for our history teachers in this because they had handed out material, background reading material for our history course. And the material, because it had been handed out in September 1975, contained quite a lot about Deng Xiaoping and the Huaihai campaign, which was the great military campaign to take southern China. And in this material that we'd been handed at the beginning, he was a terrifically important military leader in that campaign. And, you know, he was a leading light, as it were. But of course, when you got to the spring of 1976, when he's being accused of being a tremendous capitalist roader, this is rather embarrassing. So we were told to hand back our material, and we had a special lecture on the Huaihai campaign by one of the soldiers in our class, which was one of those wonderful military history campaigns with great arrows going here, there, you know, as the 4th Army does this, the 5th Army, and so on. I mean, fairly incomprehensible. But he left us really in no doubt that if Deng Xiaoping had been in charge of the Huaihai campaign, as our teaching material has suggested, then Nanjing would probably still be in Chiang Kai-shek's hands. So we had easy evidence of the fact that party history is not easy to tell when you're dealing with important people whose views on things might change or who are viewed at different times in different places. And if we're looking at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, there are certain difficulties which have to be addressed. If I leave out Stalin for the moment, and in a sense he's the most important, there were campaigns in 1956, Mao's famous call, as it were, for criticism, which I think was probably originally well meant. Let 100 flowers blossom and 100 schools of thought contend. The idea that, you know, we've got to 1956 from 1949. You know, what can we do? What are your practical ideas? But that did have a very, it rebounded on some people who took their criticism too far. And the Great Leap Forward of 1958, which is a very, very much a sort of a campaign characteristic of Chairman Mao, who from the very beginning really had his own ideas and wanted to impose them on the country. The Great Leap Forward was the idea of bringing industry to the countryside. And so furnaces, backyard furnaces were set up all over the place, and people tried to make iron with rather dubious ingredients. But Mao said with enthusiasm, the Great Leap Forward is a question of walking on 2 legs. Stalin has only 1 leg, and that is heavy industry. So his idea of the backyard furnaces, the rural industry, was very much his own, but it was unfortunately followed by famine and the Sino-Soviet split. To come back to Stalin, I mean, the enormous problem that the Chinese Communist Party had from the very beginning was the question of what is Russia going to do? What is Soviet Russia going to do? They did have a representative of 2 representatives of the Comintern at their first Congress, and there were always Soviet supporters around. But fundamentally, the enormous difficulty for the Chinese Communist Party was that Stalin took the line that China was not an industrialized country, so it couldn't have a proper proletarian revolution as had happened in Russia, and well, although one could argue a bit about that, but you know, as was posited by Marx and Engels in the industrialized West. China was not industrialized. It had a tiny industrial base, and fundamentally the great mass of the people were peasants. And Stalin therefore suggested and insisted right up until 1949 that the communists should join in with Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, the KMT, Kuomintang, because they should then work together for an industrial, as it were, revolution, and only then could they kind of become proper communists. Could they look towards a proper communist revolution? Now, Mao and some others felt very strongly that it was terribly important to mobilize the masses, and the fact that the masses in China were peasants did not disturb them. They were not bothered by the fact that these were not proper proletarians. And Mao, from the very beginning, began to work with peasants and made his base amongst peasants, and his base grew and grew and grew. I should say that all of these problems were ones that weren't really addressed in our official classes in Peking University. The Cultural Revolution, however, which was still going on, was absolutely fine. And I'll come back to the Cultural Revolution as that period of 10 years, which greatly affected China at the time. One of the great heroes who was kind of created, as it were, for young communists was Lei Feng, who managed to be a kind of perfect model. He was said to have been born a peasant. He then worked in a factory and he became a soldier. So he was a worker, peasant, soldier model. And the pictures of him, usually with his flapped hat, were absolutely all over the place. He left a diary, it is said, in which he described his selfless acts. He liked to get up really early in the morning and mend other people's underwear and wash other people's socks, and generally speaking was an absolute model sort of Boy Scout character, who died unfortunately when he was directing a lorry to reverse, and it hit a telegraph pole which fell on his head. But he remained the kind of hero of the time, and his image was everywhere. And the one at the bottom there is actually quite a recent picture, as Lei Feng was kind of brought back to revive the spirit of selflessness. Now, if we look at the achievements of the Communist Party, I mean, they were quite extraordinary, in fact. The most important, perhaps, first, victory against Japan and then victory against Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese had been pushing into China during the First World War. They'd taken Shandong, all the German colonies in Shandong and elsewhere were taken over by the Japanese, and in the Versailles Treaty were given to the Japanese instead of being returned to China, which was, I think many people feel that the feeling of hurt about Versailles, the fact that Japan had got all this territory in China, had been given away by the Allies. China had been an ally in the First World War, officially joined the Allies in 1917, but had already provided thousands of laborers to work behind the front in France, many of whom died. That they had made considerable sacrifices for the First World War, and yet Japan comes in and manages to seize Chinese territory. And the Japanese were not content with the ex-German colonies in Shandong, but they moved into Manchuria in 1929, set up the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932, and in 1937 launched a full-scale invasion of China. Now, the US and Soviet support was basically for Chiang Kai-shek. The Americans and the Japanese, the Russians at the time, all wanted Japan to be defeated, and they supported Chiang Kai-shek with armaments, with military material, with money, vast sums of money, to encourage him to use his armies to resist the Japanese. And though the communists were morally supported to a tiny extent by the Soviet Union, physically they were hardly supported at all. The communists were Chiang Kai-shek's main enemy. He didn't pay enough attention to Japan and to fighting Japan and to the effect the Japanese invasion was having on the Chinese people. And it's absolutely extraordinary the way that he spent an enormous amount of time and money and lost men and so on, trying to crush communists. And it was a terribly, terribly depressing aspect of this period, that Chiang Kai-shek was held back from resisting the Japanese. I mean, the Americans were mad keen to get him to fight. You know, they sent General Stilwell, then there was General Wedemeyer. They poured an enormous amount of money and men into China to try and support Chiang Kai-shek in resistance against Japan. But instead of that, he spent more of his time attacking communists. In 1927, there was a very famous massacre in Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek had moved from the south with an army, hoping to take the north from warlords who were fighting across China. And in 1927, the workers in Shanghai, as it were, seized the city for his army, which then came in and massacred them. The Communist Party was almost completely destroyed by this massacre. Mao and several others escaped to form the Jiangxi Soviet, which grew and grew. In 1931, it was set up, and it was a base area in which Mao and those who followed him developed work amongst the peasants, making land reform, getting the peasants on their side, living with the peasants and encouraging them. And Chiang Kai-shek, instead of supporting this or instead of fighting the Japanese, led 5 enormous encirclement campaigns of the Jiangxi Soviet, so that the Mao Zedong and his followers were forced to set off on the Long March in 1934-5. They marched 9,000 kilometers in 370 days, and only 1/10 of those who set out actually arrived in the north of China, northwest of China, in Yan'an, and they set up a new base area, so a new Soviet area in which they were going to practice land reform, redistribute land, get the peasants on their side. And an important aspect of work in Yan'an in particular was resist the Japanese. The failure of Chiang Kai-shek to resist the Japanese had an enormous effect on, particularly, so you could take the intellectual class in China. People from the north of China, from all the universities in the north and the eastern seaboard, trekked to Yan'an because that was where resistance to Japan was happening. And Chiang Kai-shek, being preoccupied with defeating communists rather than Japanese, completely lost popular support, you could say. And despite the enormous amount of money that was poured into his campaign. So, I mean, it was an extraordinary achievement for the communists to first set up their Jiangxi Soviet, be driven out of it, had to set off on the Long March, losing thousands of people, set up again in Yan'an, this tiny little place up in the northwest. But from Yan'an, set up a base in which they harried the Japanese, they gained soldiers, they built up armies, and eventually managed to take control of the whole of China as Chiang Kai-shek left for Taiwan. If we think back to sort of how China was, particularly when I first visited it in the 70s, it was still a kind of immensely rural sort of place. There's a picture, this is of Peking University students transplanting rice seedlings, which was very difficult. We had to spend a day there up to our ankles in mud, attempting to plant rice seedlings, which I found extremely difficult. You put them in and then they just seem to float away. And China was a place where we were very reliant, particularly in the north, upon cabbage. From about October through to March, there was almost only one, apart from onions, there was only really one vegetable, and that was Chinese cabbage, these great baitai, which were absolutely everywhere. These were the things that we had been bundling in the fields, and which finally came out onto the streets, in the markets. But there was literally, it was just cabbage, cabbage, cabbage. So, I mean, it was a poor place. I mean, you could eat, but it was monotonous. And then there was fantastic excitement in March when you get, as down here, you can see there's a cart with celery on it. And that was at last a new vegetable. It was very, very exciting. At that time, I mean, all the vegetables were moved into town by mule and donkey and horse carts. I remember the first night I was ever in China, sleeping in the Peking Hotel, which many of you may know, which is on Chang'anjie, the great avenue that runs through the center of Peking. I mean, it is Regent Street, Oxford Street, and Bond Street all kind of roll into one, a massive great avenue. I woke up to a very strange noise, looked out of the hotel window and saw a flock of sheep being driven along Chang'an Avenue. It really was, being in Peking was almost like being in a small country town. And people traveled almost invariably by bicycle. Rural China, as you can see here, very much decorated with slogans. It says there, listen to Chairman Mao's words, and so on. And this is, again, the Tiananmen Square in 1975. You can see there's almost no traffic on the road, a couple of buses and an army jeep and one taxi, some bicycles. In those days, you were allowed to bicycle right the way across the square. And here you can see peasant visitors visiting Peking. It's quite cold, so they're wearing padded clothing, as you can see, and very simple clothing. The colors are really almost invariably blue or army green, army khaki, or gray. Small children slightly more colorful, but people led very simple lives with very little in the way of material goods. And this is, this is incredibly recent history. Much of Peking was covered with these little courtyard houses, which I'm terribly fond of. Little houses, little low grey houses with a courtyard. You can see in almost all of them, invariably in the courtyard, there's a tree. Very important for the tree, if possible, to be deciduous, because in summer you want the shade of the leaves to cool the house and the courtyard, but in winter you want the winter sun to penetrate into the houses. Sadly, there are very, very, very few of these traditional courtyard houses left now in Beijing and indeed almost anywhere else. And if you didn't travel by bike, a favorite way of traveling was in the back of an army lorry. And here you can see public transport. There are a couple of trolley buses. This is just leading up to the great the great gate of Tiananmen. On the other side, you've got the Tiananmen Square, and you can see again how simple this is in the summer. How simply people are dressed, just very, very plain clothing, just a shirt and trousers, nothing much else. So China was a very restrained sort of place. As in winter, this is things that were quite nice were gatherings of people on street corners often. I mean, here, this is outside the main bookshop in Liulichang, which is a little street which was famous for antique shops and bookshops. It was very much the haunt of the intellectuals. But you would find one of the great things about winter in China in those days was that if there was sun, which there was almost every day, it was really quite warm to sit outside. So you can see here people in padded clothes, but sitting outside, enjoying the winter sun with a pram to hold babies. I mean, there are grannies and grandpas there looking after babies and just generally sitting out, enjoying the sun. This is one of the things that has changed dramatically, which, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, that pollution, particularly air pollution in China now, and especially in Beijing, is absolutely terrible. And so you don't get the winter sun in the same way that you did before. The skies are not clear. This is people reading the newspaper with interest. Now, to come to moments of change in the history of the Communist Party, it was very clear in 1976 that people wanted change. They were quite tired of the sort of monotony of life, of the lack of consumer goods, of the fairly repetitive political movements which were endlessly being launched. I mean, the movement to campaign against Deng Xiaoping, for example. You saw people having to go off to mass meetings, taking their stool with them and having to listen to all of this. And they were visibly rather fed up. I mean, too much had been happening. They wanted a rest. And it was just gradually after that you began to see the appearance of sort of traditional images on doorways here in that people putting up New Year posters and New Year slogans and so on. But in 1977, one of the things that pleased me a lot was to see the sudden arrival of foreign films. Up until the middle of 1976, for the whole of the Cultural Revolution, the only films that were available were Chinese films, which were immensely propagandist, or Korean films, which were equally propagandist, and that was it. But with excitement, in 1977, with a gradual opening up of China after the death of Mao, you started seeing foreign films. I mean, in this case, a very old one, a film called £1 Million Note, which is obviously really intended as a sort of satire on capitalism, because it's about the difficulty of actually spending £1 million note. But nevertheless, it came out, it was possible for people to see things which were slightly different, slightly more amusing. And one of the most important moments, really, in the history of the Chinese Communist Party is the death of Mao in 1976. And very shortly afterwards, the reappearance of Deng Xiaoping. They had worked together for many, many decades, but they clearly had different ideas about things. And until 1976, though, as we say, there have been line struggles, there have been campaigns against people had gone down, there had been attacks on this person and that person and so on, Mao had, generally speaking, held the major position, and his ideas like the Great Leap Forward and so on, and the Cultural Revolution were all important. I mean, the Cultural Revolution, I think you can see as a sort of last gasp, and a last gasp in trying to keep the idea of revolution alive, trying to keep the spirit of change and revolution and revolutionary spirit alive. He wanted to engage young people, make them feel what it was like to go on a long march, to criticize people, to take part in a mass demonstration, to feel communism, as it were. I mean, he looked at Russia and thought it had become sunk really in corruption and comfort, that, you know, all people wanted was to have a dacha in the countryside and lead a comfortable life. And he was very against that. He wanted people to still feel this spark of revolution. And so, you know, his quotations are always things like, a single spark can start a forest fire. Let's get going. Revolution is not a dinner party, and so on. But then you have Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was someone who I think, I mean, he was less ideologically pure in a sense. I mean, he had a very long history, joined the communist movement in France during the First World War. He went over, just before actually, went over as a worker student to France, as did Zhou Enlai, and he worked for a while in a Renault factory, but he imbibed the ideas of revolution abroad, came back to China and very much participated, but he retained a much less sort of ideological approach. I mean, he was definitely a pragmatist. He obviously could feel that things were changing, that people wanted different things, and he felt that the Communist Party had to move with that, whereas Mao was very much fixed on revolution and only revolution. So Deng Xiaoping saying it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, and indeed to get rich is glorious. And very shortly after the death of Mao, he came back into power and launched what is known as the sort of great opening up. And China was indeed transformed very, very dramatically and very, very quickly. I mean, I think it's to Deng Xiaoping one can credit the extraordinary appearance that Rachel mentioned just now, these great forests of buildings, the great expansion of Chinese towns, the huge building projects that went on. I mean, Shanghai now stretches for hundreds of miles more than it ever used to. If you look all over China, there was a time, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, when they said that the 10 biggest cranes in the world were all working in China, and you really felt it. I mean, China transformed the agricultural base to quite a large extent. So Deng Xiaoping was working with the lowest of the low and the highest of the high. He made an economic transformation in China, which lasts until this day. And I think if one's looking, as it were, if one's thinking to look at the achievement of the Communist Party, the most important thing to me is that it has raised hundreds of millions of people out of dire poverty with the reforms, I mean, largely Deng Xiaoping's reforms in agriculture, in the expansion and encouragement of private enterprise. But it has produced a very different sort of China. And I think those who go to China now will see it in a very different sort of way. I mean, just pictures of Shanghai that, you know, you have the sort of green spaces in Shanghai in 1976, and then Shanghai, which is a forest of building in 2010, and goes on and on and on. And one of the things that I find quite funny is that is a sort of rebuilding of a lot of tourist sites. I mean, China's is very keen on promoting tourism now. And one of the sites that I'm very fond of is that of the Leifeng Pagoda in Hangzhou, which is a very beautiful lake city that many people visit. And the Leifeng Pagoda was built in 975. In 1924, it collapsed. Before it collapsed, it looked like that sort of tump with buddleia growing out of it. But it collapsed in a great sort of shower of bricks in 1924. And we know this because there was several British missionaries in Hangzhou who collected some of the bricks. And inside the bricks that formed the pagoda, they found tiny little scrolls with dharani, little Buddhist chants on them. And these are, you know, quite important because if the pagoda was consecrated in 975, these are very early examples of printing. So, you know, in terms of library history, 1924 is very important. It's when they discover the Leifeng Ta dharani. And so the thing is completely flattened. Hangzhou, as I knew it from 1971 up until 2003, didn't have a Leifeng pagoda, but it's now been built just outside the grounds of one of the luxury hotels. And it's now got a steel frame with a lift and it's lit up at night. So the quotation that saying ancient monuments are springing up all over China was something that Fitzroy Maclean said. And it's certainly true that places where pagodas used to be, suddenly there's a pagoda. This is built with a sense of national pride, partly because in China, national tourism is actually infinitely more important than international tourism. There are far more Chinese people who want to explore their own country than there are international tourists. I mean, just because there are so many people in China and they are now increasingly wealthy, increasingly able to travel. They can also travel abroad, but many have spent their happy times exploring China itself. And that has really changed China. It's changed the railway system. There are so many more flights all over the place. And this all for internal tourism, which is of great importance. Now, Deng Xiaoping died just before the handover of Hong Kong, which was something that he was obviously very keen on. And now the current paramount leader is Xi Jinping. And he had launched quite early on this the slogan, the China Dream. This is a slogan that annoys me intensely for various reasons. One is that it's a straightforward borrowing from the American dream. It's just taken from that. So China Dream is the equivalent, and that obviously involves things like being rich and being a powerful nation. Doesn't seem to come to me with any very kind of really inspiring aspects. But also the thing that really annoys me is that it, as well as pinching the American slogan, it is a slogan that just doesn't fit properly into Chinese. It's because 中国梦 is 3 characters. And in China, 3 characters doesn't sound right. Really, you always want 4 for balance. You can see on the lower poster there that you've got 中国梦, 我的梦. So actually that sounds slightly kind of better. But basically, anyway, as I say, it's a terribly annoying, it's like a newspaper headline. It's kind of truncated a proper Chinese phrase, and it would be nicer to have a proper Chinese phrase. But Xi Jinping is now obviously in the place where Mao was, and is leading China, is leading the Chinese Communist Party. As we all know, the China in the world is now a very different place. I used to think that particularly under Mao, I mean, I don't think for Mao, the outside world was very important. The outside world had really treated China incredibly badly. If you start, particularly with the Soviet Union treated China appallingly badly by failing to support the communists in their resistance against Japan, by supporting Chiang Kai-shek until the very last minute, and then always treating China as the kind of the latecomer, the younger brother, the unimportant. There's not someone who is going to be able to lead the communist world. And you had a very weird time in the 70s when if the Soviet Union took a line on a country or something, China frequently found itself sort of pushed into the position of taking the opposite one because of the Sino-Soviet split. So you'd get China kind of, as it were, finding itself on the wrong side of debates because the Russians had marched in and taken first pole position. And I don't think that, I mean, it gradually became important to join the United Nations, for example. I mean, in 71, when I went to China the first time, Nixon's forthcoming visit had just been announced, and everywhere there was news about that. That was the first time that China really kind of showed so much interest in the outside world. But I think in general, lacking an experience of the outside world for so long, and lacking the trained diplomats for such a long period, because China had not really kind of invested hugely in diplomacy, rather regarded diplomacy as being a kind of a trick, a sort of a complicated game that was best played by the French and the British and really not for China. That they really needed kind of more experience of the outside world. But Deng Xiaoping continued an opening of China. China has opened much more to the outside world and is very much more prominent, as we're all aware. And of course, one of the main ways of China's engagement with the outside world is this opening of the so-called New Silk Road. This was just a seminar that I went to in Hangzhou on Hangzhou and the New Silk Road. I get invited to these things as a representative of the old Silk Road because I wrote a book about Marco Polo, so I get dragged along to talk about the past. But effectively, the New Silk Road, One Belt, One Road, is an example of China looking outward for natural resources all over the world and for trade. And this is a picture of the first train, which came all the way from China to Spain, carrying plastic toys for Christmas. And then a picture of the world's largest container ship from China, which has got 19,000 containers on it, all of which fills me with some horror. But and also looking at China today, Rachel mentioned building, and I also mentioned polluting. It is truly extraordinary. If you travel in China today, if you drive through any city, the cities go on and on forever with these enormous blocks of flats. I mean, massive, huge, beyond the scale of anything that we see, vast, vast housing estates which go on forever. And in some places, in parts, out in the Gobi Desert, which is an area that I've been to quite a lot recently, you have what are almost ghost towns, which have been built out on the fringes of the desert. Again, these huge blocks of flats, great wide empty avenues with almost nobody there. They're sort of ready for a population to move into, but haven't yet been built. I mean, I think there's a kind of, it's part of a sort of economic infrastructure construction, but I mean, they still remain slightly baffling to me. So China has been building, but of course, and it has also been polluting. I mean, it has to be said that China is, at the same time as polluting itself, as it were, it is fairly amazingly present in attempts to reduce pollution. I mean, again, if you take the Gobi Desert, you can drive for hundreds of miles through what are in effect fields of things that all sorts of ways of kind of capturing the power of sunlight, wind power. I mean, they're very, very keen to use different means of heating and fueling the country. But I mean, that means that the countryside is covered with photoelectric great voltage things. It's fairly sort of hideous, but it is an attempt to work against the pollution that is there. It's so where the Communist Party has come to now, where China's Communist Party has got to after 100 years, I think is a very, very, is a strange place, I would say. I think China, China has become a country with far fewer poor people. I mean, that is the most amazing achievement. Feeding the population, reducing the population. I mean, we know now that, of course, the population of young people has been rather drastically reduced, and so needs to be encouraged. Otherwise, they're going to have, as we do, too many old people, not enough young. The problems that come with those sorts of campaigns are with China. I think the feeding of the country is amazing, and that we should never forget that. But where China is going now is very much part of the 21st century. It is a more nationalistic country than it was before, I think in part because of being more open to the outside world, engaging more with the outside world, engaging with the economy of the outside world has brought criticism, and that provokes further criticism. It's in quite a complicated place. But one of the things that I find puzzling really is that it is, I would say that China now is really not nearly so much of an ideological place as it was under Mao. I think whilst Mao was in charge, there was always the idea that you had to keep ideology in control, in command. The ideology was not strictly Marxist or Marxist-Leninist. It was Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. It was very much Mao's thought, but his idea was to remain an ideological country and not care about the outside world. And someone like Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist, was not a great ideologue. Nobody went round waving his thoughts. But on the other hand, he was really more influential than Mao in the last great push to bring people out of poverty, because during the Cultural Revolution, people were really quite held back. They might not be starving, but they lacked an enormous number of kind of domestic conveniences that we would think made their lives better. I mean, I can think back to friends' houses in the early 1970s, and they shared one cold water tap with several other families. There were all sorts. They were very overcrowded. They had to cook on funny little stoves. I mean, now you go to people's houses and they're lovely. They've got air conditioning, which they probably shouldn't have for the pollution aspect. But I mean, they have comforts. They have fridges. They have cookers. They have this. They have that. They have access to so much more. And they're like things like just hot water for flush showers and baths. So much more comfortable than they were. So bringing the standard of living of the ordinary people up has been fantastically important. But the Communist Party, it seems to me, has slightly lost its ideological bite since the death of Mao. And I'll just sort of end slightly with the fact that in China now, I mean, there is a new history of the Communist Party written. I mean, people are looking at it now, which will cover much of the ground that I mentioned, but it's still going to have these gaps. I mean, where we in Peking University in 1975 to 6 didn't learn anything about the Great Leap Forward or the 100 Flowers movement. I mean, they were kind of glossed over slightly. I went back to Peking University just a few years ago, and it was a celebration of 60 years of Liu Xuesheng, foreign students. We always used to think we were a terrible nuisance to Peking University, but it was very kind of them to celebrate the idea that they had in some way kind of enjoyed it. And there was a large contingent of foreign students, most of whom were fairly recent students from places like Japan and America. But there was, and the earliest ones, so there was a wonderful Romanian couple who had been at Peking University, I think in the 50s. And then he had been their later ambassador, Romanian ambassador to China. And so they retained a strong contact with China. And in fact, their daughter was also married a diplomat who served as a younger Romanian ambassador to China. So we had the older group and we had the more recent, but there was quite a large group of us who had studied there in the 70s, including me and the head of the Berlin libraries. She had been a student there, and the wonderful Harro Senger, who's a Swiss expert on China and international law, and Johnny, a German a journalist. Though lots of us who'd been there in the 70s, in the last gasp of the Cultural Revolution, but all the celebratory material we were given, including a book which celebrated the foreign students of over 60 years, it had a complete gap from 1966 to the late 70s. So the Cultural Revolution is currently the big problem in writing party history. It's too recent, too much within living memory for it to be dealt with easily. There are too many people whose parents suffered terribly in the Cultural Revolution. Even people whose own lives were distorted by the events of the Cultural Revolution. So I think when writing party history in China, there are always going to be difficulties, and we'll probably have to wait another 100 years before the history of the Cultural Revolution period is actually properly written. I think that's yes, if I may, I'll stop sharing. Is that all right?
Yes, lovely. Thank you, Francis. I knew that we would feel that we could listen to you all night, actually, because there's just so much, and being able to bring your own perspective to this is just fantastic, wonderful. I mean, the Chinese all often do have that saying, don't they, about it being too soon to say anything about events that we would think are already deep history. So no wonder the Cultural Revolution still hasn't found its way into a settled place in their narrative of themselves. It's extraordinary, I think, to us in the West. I think the most amazing thing is the coexistence, isn't it, of this single party and the hard line that they take on so many aspects, especially since Xi Jinping has been supreme leader. That'll do. Yeah, and then this extraordinary mega capitalist phase that has outshone everybody else in the way that, you know, we couldn't have imagined it would be unleashed 40 odd years ago. Now, are there some people with questions before I ask some? Well, yes. Why? Oh, there's one here from Christine Holstock. Why is Peking now called Beijing?
This is a question that I'm very fond of answering. Beijing for the last, I have to think back, because it was in the 30s, it was called Beiping. The city that we know as Beijing or Peking has always in the northern Chinese dialect been known as Beijing. That's how it's pronounced. And it's how it's written in the Pinyin romanization, which the Chinese use now. Peking is a romanization which was made in the 17th century by French Jesuits, who bizarrely rendered the sound j or ch with a k. Now, I still call it Peking, and that's partly because, you know, I'm English, and in a sense, in English, Peking has been Peking for a very long time, if you look back through English literature. Also, Peking University has decided that its English name is going to be Peking University, not Beijing University. But I mean, it's that, you know, do we call do we call it Leghorn or Livorno? Do we call it Rome or Roma? Do we call it Paris or Paris or whatever? Call it either. Either will do.
It's just one of those things. So Joe has asked, what are keys to success for the Chinese Communist Party for the next 100 years?
Well, I think, I mean, one would be maintenance of the Communist Party for the next 100 years. And, you know, someone like Xi Jinping would hope that he might be in charge for the next 100 years, because he has made it a position now that, you know, it's not, Deng Xiaoping shortened, made it a 4-year term like other places, but Deng Xiaoping has made it a lifelong thing. Xi Jinping has made it a lifelong thing. I feel that, I mean, the Communist Party, it's very much up to them, not me, but I feel they really need to kind of refine their ideology, refine it in a sense of not just being tough, but having some kind of ideology, having dreams. I mean, they call it socialism with Chinese character. The China dream. I mean, to define the China dream would be one thing.
And could they find their way forward? You know, you say about, I take the point about the nationalist mentality coming about because they are aware of them as opposed to others now in a way that they weren't under Mao. But now they're aware of themselves with the rest of us in this pickle that we're in with the climate. Could the next phase perhaps be them? I know you mentioned about the huge push on the energy infrastructure, but really taking a lead and showing how when you do things at pace, at speed, you know, that is the way to really make a major difference.
That would be brilliant if that could happen. I think it's complicated and it would be slow, but it'd be wonderful if one had someone, or if Xi Jinping could take on more of a sort of Deng Xiaoping approach and lead in that way. I mean, to be unafraid. But there are plenty of coal mines in China still, plenty of coal mines being built. It's a huge job to deal with China, let alone the outside world.
On a completely different tack, somebody's asked, what made you want to study Chinese back then when it was so uncommon?
It was really just being perverse. I think I wanted to learn a language that was as different and as difficult as possible. And I'm just internally grateful, actually, that I chose Chinese. I mean, I thought of Arabic, I thought of Japanese, and Japanese is rather different now, but even then, when I was starting in the late 60s, Japan was still a rather sort of anti-female society. And I think to learn Arabic would be terribly sad, and it would be very difficult for me to work in many places. In China, you know, women do have a reasonable position, and learning the language has been a way into, you know, an amazing culture, which has all sorts of things wrong with it, but which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it can fascinate you all your life, even just the language itself, the way that characters are put together, the way that people say things. It's absolutely fascinating.
You say about it being easier for women to have some role and come to prominence there, but the party itself?
Not at the moment, no. There have been much better moments for the party. I don't think Xi Jinping has paid any attention to that. No, I used to know at one point the Minister of Textiles because she'd come up to, she was a great friend of Lord Rhodes, who used to go to China quite often. And she did say that it was very difficult for women to take really senior positions. She'd managed because her husband died, and she found she didn't have to bother with him. She could get on with work. I mean, but in general, the position of women is not too bad, but it's true. I'm not sure actually how many really want to be right at the top in that way, perhaps, because I think, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about Xi Jinping's era is that it's pretty cutthroat up there, that he's not very tolerant of any sort of potential rivals. So it'd be better to be slightly lower down.
Yes, probably. But you know, these. Anyway, I will move on to the next question, which is, what do you think of Yung Chang's account of the Cultural Revolution in her biography of Mao? The author also of Wild Swans, in case people don't recognise the name.
It's ages since I wrote it, and I read it. Sorry, wrote it. It's ages since I read it. At the time, I found it's not entirely convincing. I mean, I think there is more fiction to it than people might think. I think there are better accounts.
It'd be very interesting to know your recommendation perhaps later. What do you think are the chances of human rights being taken, I was going to say more seriously, human rights being respected in a way that we tend to expound from our side of the world culture?
I mean, there are going to be lots of areas that people are going to raise about which, you know, I wish and I hope, and I think, I mean, I think it would be good if we can keep reminding the Chinese that actually human rights doesn't mean, you know, the end of the Communist Party. It doesn't mean the end of this, that, and the other. You know, let people speak. I mean, the words do not kill. You know, you can have free speech and nobody pays any attention. I think the trouble is, I think that we have, the government always says, oh, well, we keep going on about that free speech to them and human rights. And I think that's no good at that level. I think, you know, the governments know, you sit down with your opposite number, premier this, premier that, and you say, your human rights record is very bad. And they say yes, and that's it. I mean, nothing happens. I think it would be much better if we can work at much lower levels and just demonstrate that a free press doesn't mean the end of the world, that kind of thing. I mean, just try and point out to people that the freedom to express yourself is not going to bring the government down. And
yet you mentioned about the Let 100 Flowers Bloom having been, you know, they've quickly sidelined that, Mao, in his time, because it actually made too much bloom.
Yes, and if you're really cynical, I mean, people say, you know, it was kind of then used. The addresses were taken down, and people who had been critical were punished for it. Yeah, we have to try and make sure. I mean, we have to sort of, I don't know, by example, through literature, through cinema, through television, through and through human contact, just make it clear that free speech is not going to kind of kill the government.
So you favour all these exchanges and the twin cities. By the way, Hangzhou is one of our twin cities. It's the Chinese twin city of Leeds, and so some
your lake?
Yeah, sorry.
Where's your lake?
Yeah. No, we haven't got a lake to show off to China. No.
Twinning is mad. I mean, I think it's lovely, but it's absolutely bananas that cities which seem to have absolutely nothing kind of in common are brought together. I mean, Chongqing and Bristol, I suppose you could say both are kind of, for both of them, water is important. But I mean, Bristol is on the coast and Chongqing is about as far inland in China as you can possibly get without hitting India. But anyway, no, yes, I think more exchange, more people.
Yeah, yes.
2 lakes in Roundhay Park, yeah, but they're not as big as Hangzhou.
Peter Reynolds has asked about the plans for succession, but I believe that President Xi hasn't got plans for succession.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's a problem. It's a problem with people in power all over the world, isn't it? I mean, Mao didn't like to think about succession, and definitely didn't. And anyone who ever became his kind of number 2 tended to disappear you know, and die, as it were. But people always say Zhou Enlai was always clever because he was always number 3, never number 2. So, I mean, that I just think that's a problem with people who see themselves as omnipotent and take that view. No, there's no, I mean, something will happen, but definitely Xi Jinping is not himself indicating that he's going to leave soon or that anyone else is going to take over.
Oh, I should have just come down to the questions about the Uyghurs. I mean, would you also say we can't directly confront the Chinese about the Uyghurs?
I think we can, governments can, but they're going to, now with China in a more kind of aggressive mood, I think, you know, they'll have to take what comes. And I think, I mean, I find it desperately sad, because I think it's, well, it's another instance of racism, really. I mean, and education is the only hope for any of us to get over racist ideas and racist treatment. It's, I mean, I don't buy the fact that it's terrorist. I mean, I think the Uyghurs have to some extent been pushed into terrorism, probably, by the way that they've been treated. It is racist.
Do you hold out hope that perhaps when this generation of Chinese, so many thousands of whom have studied abroad, go back and you know, have their careers there, that China will become a different place because of their experiences of being out in the world in a way that their parents, grandparents never were?
Hope. I mean, that's the sort of area we have to put, where we have to have hope. I think that, you know, that all of us, wherever we are, should become less racist and learn, you know, that people are people are people. And yes, if we can make it one of the things that we try and teach people when they're over here, then that's very important.
Oh, it's being pointed out to me, which I should be very aware of, that we do have lakes, 2 lakes in Roundhay Park, but probably not as substantial as the ones in Hangzhou. They are a great resource, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so somebody else has mentioned also about perhaps could we work on China to outlaw the death penalty? I mean, again, is this something that
yes,
you know, we can have an alliance of, but you see, the trouble is that there are other countries not setting a good example as well, aren't there? And in that respect and in others. So the Chinese would say, you know, that whatever their proverbial equivalent is, those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
yeah, yes, that's always slightly difficult. Yes, I mean, I remember when we were there, whenever, this is because it was a long time ago, whenever we raised sort of moments of fury, we were always reminded about Northern Ireland, and you know, this was before Belfast agreements and so on. I mean, people are always quick to point out the holes in one's own argument. We have to be careful. But I mean, on things like racism, we can be fairly straight.
Yes, exactly. We've had some bad experiences here just recently, haven't we? Revealing the extent to which, you know, there are elements of the British population who are far from beyond reproach in that regard. And you say about a free press, you know, so much here. Do we really have a free press? How much, you know, control behind the scenes is going on in less overt ways, perhaps, than where you've got this one-party state notion, where we know who's in charge and we know what the tendency is and where it's coming from. Whereas here, it's all, you know, more insidious and different forces working in different ways underneath the surface. Anyway, I feel as if are there any more questions from people in the audience? So, but there's still quite a lot of people here. Is anybody else wanting to ask something? I just want to share my screen to show you about our next event. So I'll just do that if I may. Except that I can't. Current slide. There we are. So I'm sorry that these are not yet scheduled. I'm still waiting on further details from our speakers, but this is going to be a really interesting mini series about artificial intelligence, both the technological side of it and also the ethical side. I mean, again, massive topic, but that's what we do in the Phil and Lit. We take these huge topics and try and encourage our speakers to cover all this territory within a very short time and bring those of us with a very small amount of knowledge up a steep learning curve during the event. So I'll leave it to our president, if you're there still, Eric, to come in and yes, thank you.
Hello. Thanks, Rachel, and thank you very much, Francis. That's been a fascinating insight into a very big topic for us all and the world. And you've given us a very great overview of this subject. So thank you very much for coming to Leeds, the city of two lakes, to tell us about that. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you, and thank you all for logging on tonight, and for your questions, which were as ever very thought-provoking and quite terrific. So thank you, everybody in the audience. We hope we'll be able to welcome you back to the artificial intelligence talk starting in September. We're taking a break in August, and we've got a lot more talks in the pipeline. Also, Rachel has been working with some other people to develop a new website, and that will be going live in a couple of weeks, Rachel. So
well, I hope so. No more than that.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a beta version, and we're looking at the final version of it now. So please keep looking at the website, and that there'll be plenty of opportunities to get involved with that, with LPLS, no matter where you are in the world. So thank you all, and all the best. Keep calm, keep cool, and enjoy the summer. Thank you.
I have to thank you very much to everybody. If Hao Yu Zhang, if you're still there and you would like to ask your question to Francis, I'm really sorry that I skipped over that. If you'd like to come in now, I'm going to stop recording though, because otherwise we'll run out of. Okay.